She gave life and nearly lost hers. And in that quiet moment, the father changed everything. The storm had passed, but its weight still pressed against the mountain like an ache that refused to lift. The forest stood still, every branch heavy with snow, every breath of wind soft like a hush. Deep in a cave where light barely reached, a silence thicker than any blizzard hung in the air. She lay there, still exhausted, her breath shallow. Her body, once powerful and proud, was now trembling beneath the weight of what she had just endured. Blood mixed with melting snow at the cave's entrance, and her eyes barely stayed open long enough to see the tiny life curled against her chest. He was breathing. She was not sure she still was. And he watched. The male, massive, scarred, and feared, stood just beyond the threshold. No one would have blamed him for leaving. Nature rarely asked fathers to stay, but he didn't move. His breath steamed in the cold air, steady and warm. He watched the cub's tiny chest rise and fall against her fur. He saw the tremor in her limbs, the fragility, the fading strength, and then he stepped forward, not with a growl, not with dominance, but something else. Something few had seen, something gentler than nature ever taught him. Something like love. He didn't understand birth, not the pain, not the sacrifice, but he understood silence. And what filled the air now was not peace, but the kind of stillness that followed a wound too deep to name. She wasn't moving. The cub, barely strong enough to lift its head, whimpered once, then pressed closer into her chest. And he, this great bear of cold and solitude, lowered himself slowly beside them. His breath met hers, shaky, fragile, almost gone. He pressed his body closer, not to claim, but to give, to lend her warmth from his massive frame, to offer the only thing he had left, his presence. He had never done this before. He didn't know what to do, but instinct gave way to something older than instinct, something quieter, more enduring. And in that quiet, something shifted. Night passed slowly, hour by hour. The winds outside wailed against the rock face, but within the cave there was only breathing. Barely. He kept his head low, his body curled protectively, never touching the cub, but never far from it. At one point the cub stirred, cried out softly. He flinched, then responded, not with sound, but with movement. He edged closer until the cub could feel his fur too. Not mother's, not familiar, but warm, and somehow safe. The mother didn't rise the next morning, but she breathed, shallow, faint, enough, and the father did not leave. For 3 days he stayed. He stood when the winds howled too loud. He guarded the entrance with his body when frost clawed into the den. He brought what food he could, dragging a broken carcass across the snow. Not because he understood hunger, but because something inside him refused to watch them fade. He licked the snow off her coat. Not perfectly, not like she would have done, but enough to keep her warm. He didn't know how to be soft, but he tried. And the cub, it watched, wide-eyed, tiny, trembling, but watching, because it didn't know yet what family meant, but it knew what staying felt like. And this was staying. And staying was not something the forest had taught him. It had taught him to roam, to fight, to feed, but not to stay, not to wait, not to watch someone so still, so broken, and choose to remain anyway. Yet here he was, choosing again and again, every moment, not to walk away. The cub began to stir more with each passing day. His cries grew louder, his legs steadier, and with every tiny sound, the father flinched, not in fear, but in unfamiliarity. He had never learned the language of need, but now he listened like it was the only thing that mattered. When the cub cried, he moved closer. When the cub shivered, he adjusted his body to block the wind. When the cub tried to climb over the mother's side, he gently nudged him back with a paw too big, too rough, but careful. So careful. And something began to form, not just survival, but bond. Not born of instinct or blood, but of decision, repeated, reinforced, felt. He began to hum, not a real sound, but a vibration, a low pulse that the cub could lean into. A signal. You are not alone. He'd never made it before. He didn't know he could. But the cub curled against him each time, tiny breaths sank to his massive ribs. And on the 5th day, she stirred, just her eyes. Nothing more. But they found his, and something passed between them. Not words, not relief, but acknowledgement. She saw him, and she knew. He had stayed, and that had made all the difference. Not the food, not the shelter, not even the stillness of his protection, but the fact that he chose to stay when everything else told him to leave. That choice, unspoken, unmapped, almost primal, was what made healing possible, not just for her, but for all 3 of them. Because healing didn't look like strength. It looked like his massive body curled smaller to let her rest. It looked like his watchful eyes blinking slowly in the dark, alert to every sound outside the cave. It looked like his silence, wrapped around her weakness like a blanket no wind could tear through. It looked like the cub now nestled between them, not needing to understand, but knowing somehow that this was safe. She moved again the next morning, a shift of her shoulder, a deeper breath. And when she tried to rise, her legs trembled. He stepped forward, not to carry her, but to stand beneath her weight. She leaned. He steadied. Not perfectly, but enough. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. She was alive. The cub was strong, and the father had stayed. That was enough to begin again. Not as they had been before, but as something new, something no wild rulebook had ever written. Because what happened in that cave didn't just rewrite their roles. It redefined what family could mean. He was never taught to nurture, never praised for patience, never needed in the way he was needed now. But need, it seemed, was its own kind of teacher, and he, rough, weathered, solitary, had begun to learn. He learned how to walk slow enough for her, how to tilt his massive head so the cub could climb onto his shoulders, if only for a moment, how to find the places where sunlight warmed the stone and guide her there without a sound. He learned that the cub laughed, a sound he didn't know bears could make, a breathy, joyful noise that came when snowflakes landed on the cub's nose or when he stumbled into a pile of leaves. And each time the cub laughed, the father froze, awestruck, as if this small being had conjured something holy from thin air. He no longer flinched when the cub cried. He responded. He no longer stood guard at a distance. He rested close, close enough to feel their breath, close enough to let his heartbeat become part of theirs. And the mother, though still healing, watched, with eyes that held exhaustion, yes, but also reverence. She had given birth, but he had given more than she ever imagined. He had given presence. And in the wild, presence was more rare than strength, more sacred than dominance, more life-saving than instinct. Because instinct would have told him to move on, to distance himself from the slow, the fragile, the wounded. But something else, something older, perhaps even deeper, held him there. And in that stillness, in that refusal to leave, something grew that no storm, no hunger, no predator could undo. Not a bond of survival, but of intention. A family not forged by chance, but by choice. He watched the cub take his first full steps outside the cave, wobbling forward on uncertain legs. He didn't intervene. He let him fall, let him rise again. And when the cub looked back, eyes wide, searching, he was there, still, present, unmoved. And the cub didn't cry. He grinned, a tiny, crooked smile only a mother would notice. But the father saw it too, and answered with a slow nod, as if to say, "Yes, I see you. Yes, I'm here." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't the kind of moment that shakes the earth. But it was enough to steady a world. And in the days that followed, the world did steady, slowly. The snow began to melt along the edges of their shelter. Her wounds knit together not just with time, but with touch, with the warmth of shared breath, with the rhythm of paws and heartbeats sinking again. They moved together, not in lines, but in loops, not in hierarchy, but in harmony. And those who saw them, rarely from a distance, didn't understand. A male that stayed, that shared space, not just strength, that gave softness, not just protection. They didn't understand, because they hadn't seen what staying could become. They hadn't seen how a presence, unchanging, unshaking, unafraid, could become the axis of an entire world. How the mere fact that someone didn't leave could teach the cub that love wasn't a moment, but a rhythm. That safety wasn't something you found. It was something someone else built for you, moment by moment, breath by breath. And this father, who had once known only solitude and survival, had become a builder, not of nests or dens, but of trust, of gentleness, of stories passed through gestures, through glances, through the quiet act of not walking away. In time, the cub grew stronger, not just in body, but in certainty. He no longer hesitated at the mouth of the cave. He no longer clung to shadows. He explored, tentatively at first, then boldly, always within reach of his father's presence. And every time he returned to the same place, beneath his father's side, next to his mother's warmth. It wasn't territory, it wasn't dominance, it was devotion. The mother, once barely clinging to life, now moved with grace again. Slowly, yes, but with purpose. And every so often, she would pause and rest her head against his massive shoulder, not to lean, but to acknowledge, to say thank you in the only language the wild understands. Silence shared with intention. Together they had become something no one expected. Not just a pair, not just survivors, but a family. And the forest held its breath to witness it. Because sometimes the most extraordinary thing is not what fights or flees, it's what stays. Even after the wounds have closed, even after the danger has passed, even after the world tells you it's safe to move on. Because staying isn't about the absence of fear, it's about choosing love anyway, again and again and again. He stayed not because he had to, but because something in him knew. This was the moment that would define not just the cub's life, but his own. This was where the story could have ended in survival, but didn't. It became something else, something greater. He had once believed strength meant solitude, that to protect, one had to stay apart, that vulnerability was weakness. But now he knew better, because he had seen how his stillness became her recovery, how his patience became the cub's courage, how his silent devotion became the soil where something softer, something sacred could take root. He didn't roar. He didn't chase off threats with fury. He simply stayed. And in doing so, he redefined what it meant to be a protector. He redefined what it meant to be a father. And when spring finally came, melting away the final frost, they stepped forward, together. Not as a triumphant return to normal, but as a quiet continuation of what they had begun in the hardest moment. No parade, no victory call, just three bodies moving in rhythm, three hearts beating to the same silent promise. I am here. I will not leave. We are whole. And that promise didn't echo through the trees. It hummed beneath them, in the ground softened by their steps, in the breeze that danced around them like memory, in the way the cub looked up, not for reassurance, but with trust already rooted. This wasn't the story the forest expected, but it became the one it would never forget. Because some stories aren't built in triumph or noise, but in stillness, in the sacred pause where someone simply chooses to stay. Everything changed, not all at once, not in some grand, sweeping way, but in the way the cub no longer whimpered in his sleep, in the way the mother rested without flinching at every rustle, in the way the father, once a silent figure at the edge of every moment, now stood close enough to be felt in every breath. It wasn't about what they had overcome. It was about what they were quietly becoming, a constellation of love mapped not in stars, but in steps shared, in glances held, in presence endured. Because in a world that too often teaches leaving, teaches fending for yourself, teaches that love is earned and fleeting, he had written a different story, one where love wasn't loud, but relentless, one where healing didn't rush, but rested, one where family wasn't defined by ease or instinct, but by intention. And he showed it in the only way that ever really lasts, by showing up again and again and again. The forest didn't need to witness it to know it was happening. The roots felt it. The wind carried it. The very soil beneath them remembered it. This is how something fragile becomes something forever. Not through force, but through choice, through devotion, through return. And so the cub began to thrive. The mother, once on the edge of life, moved not with fear, but with grace. And the father, he stayed, still, strong, soft in all the places the world had told him he couldn't be. He taught his son not how to fight, but how to love, how to wait, how to hold. And that became their legacy. Not a roar, not a mark carved in bark, but a quiet rhythm passed down in footsteps. Because when someone stays through the silence, it teaches every life it touches that they are worth staying for. And in a world that often forgets how to love gently, that lesson might just be the most powerful of all, because it doesn't ask for proof or perfection. It doesn't demand that you fix the broken or undo the past. It simply offers presence, a kind of presence that says, you don't have to carry this alone. And when that kind of presence lingers, day after day, night after night, it becomes something unshakable. It becomes trust. It becomes safety. It becomes a kind of invisible bond, stitched not with obligation, but with care that asks nothing in return. The cub grew in that space, not just in size, but in spirit. He didn't just learn how to survive. He learned how to stay, how to lean into another being without bracing for the sting of abandonment. How to rest, truly rest, knowing someone was close, watching, guarding, loving. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. And as the seasons shifted, their little family didn't return to who they were before. They couldn't. Too much had been broken, but they didn't need to go back, because something more beautiful had taken its place. A new story, one built from scars, not despite them, one shaped by stillness, not silence, one that didn't erase the pain, but wove it into something soft enough to hold others. The father didn't need to be celebrated for what he had done. He didn't need praise or acknowledgement. He only needed to know that what he gave, the quiet of his body beside theirs, the calm of his steady breath, had changed the path of a life, maybe even two. And in the hush of twilight, long after the forest had settled for the night, there they stood, mother, father, and cub, wrapped in a stillness that wasn't empty, but full of memory, full of meaning, full of a love that had been earned not through grand gestures, but through gentle endurance. And if the forest ever whispered their story, it wouldn't start with loss. It would start with staying. Not because it was easy, not because it came naturally, but because something deep in him knew. This was the moment that would shape everything that came after. Not the storm, not the struggle, but the choice. The choice to remain when it would have been simpler to walk away, to keep vigil when the world had already moved on, to believe that presence itself could be protection, that quiet could be healing, that being near was sometimes the bravest thing one could offer. He didn't leave when she lay still for hours, breath shallow, skin cold from the long, aching delivery. He didn't flinch when the cub cried out, tiny and confused, not yet knowing what fear was, but feeling it anyway. He simply stood there, close enough for them both to feel the shape of him in the dark. He didn't speak. He didn't try to fix it. He just was. And something about that was enough. Because in a world that too often teaches move on, he taught hold on. In a forest where survival often means solitude, he made space for connection. He held his family not with arms, but with attention, with silence that soothed, with presence that promised, I am here. I am not leaving, not now, not ever. And that was the legacy they would carry, not just the cub, but the mother too. A kind of deep-rooted knowing that they were not alone, that even when pain came, even when the winds blew cold and hard again, someone would still be there, anchored, steady, safe. That was what changed them. Not the danger that passed, but the devotion that stayed, that threaded itself into every waking moment that followed, not as a memory of struggle, but as a presence that anchored them to life. It wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with fanfare. It moved like breath, like heartbeat, unseen, but felt in everything. It taught the cub to walk with assurance, not because the world was gentle, but because someone had shown him what gentleness could do. It taught the mother that healing didn't mean forgetting pain, but letting love take its place beside it. The devotion stayed through the quietest nights, when the forest was so still it felt like the trees were listening. It stayed when the cub stumbled and cried, and the father nudged him gently. Not with force, but with the kind of steady patience that says, "You're allowed to fall. I will be here when you do." It stayed when the mother, still weary in ways the body can't explain, leaned her weight against his side, not to be held, but simply to be understood. They began again from that place, not because they were whole, but because they were willing. And willingness, they discovered, was enough. It was the beginning of new rhythms, new paths through familiar woods. It was what allowed the cub to grow, not in fear, but in trust. What allowed the mother to rest, knowing she didn't have to carry everything alone. And the cub, full of beginnings, found that the safest place in the world wasn't a hiding spot. It was between the hearts of those who stayed. Together, they created a language that required no words, a structure more solid than any den, one built on staying, choosing, believing, even in the darkest hour. And that transformation rippled outward, in the way the father moved just slightly closer when the wind picked up, in the way the mother pressed her nose gently to her cub's ear before sleep, in the way no one rushed. No one expected perfection. They were simply there, becoming something more than survival, becoming story, becoming home. Because the miracle wasn't just that she survived, or that he stayed, or that the cub thrived. The miracle was that they met fear with devotion, that they met uncertainty with presence, that they took what nearly ended them and chose to begin again anyway. That's what love does when it's real. It transforms everything it touches, not by force, but by simply refusing to leave. And in that refusal, the future took root, quietly, without announcement or permission, not in grand plans or distant dreams, but in the soil of now, in the breaths shared beneath the weight of what almost broke them, in the way the cub's small paw rested against his father's chest as he slept, unaware that the rhythm beneath it had changed forever. That heartbeat no longer beat only for survival, but for legacy, for presence, for all that still could be. It took root in the way they moved through the days, not perfectly, but together, with pauses for healing, with space for silence, with room for gentleness. And the world didn't shift to accommodate them. They shifted to carry the world a little differently, as if every step forward was a quiet declaration: we're still here, we still choose each other. And that choice, it became the most powerful part, because it wasn't made once, it was made again and again. Every time the father stayed close instead of wandering off. Every time the mother rested without fear because he stood watch. Every time the cub looked up and saw both of them, not gone, not distant, but there, fully there. That was how the future began, not in a moment, but in a rhythm made of trust, of staying, of not letting go. It's the kind of beginning no storm can undo, no fear can erase, no time can wither, because it was built not on instinct alone, but on choice. And choice, when made with love, becomes the strongest root of all. They didn't need a map to where they were going. They only needed each other, and that was more than enough. Because some stories don't ask for applause, they ask for presence. They're not told in victories or loud triumphs, but in the soft moments where love chooses to remain even when no one's watching. That's where this story lived, in the quiet corners of survival, in the steady breath of a family that had every reason to fall apart, but found reasons instead to stay close. The cub would never know the full weight of what his parents endured to keep him safe. He wouldn't know the nights they stayed awake, trading sleep for safety. He wouldn't remember the moments when his mother's body trembled from the effort of giving life, or the way his father stood still beside her, not knowing how to fix it, only knowing that he wouldn't leave. But he would feel it, in every guarded step they took beside him, in the way their eyes followed his every movement, not out of control, but care, in the space they made for him to grow without fear. That is how the future makes itself known. Not as something that arrives, but as something nurtured. Moment by moment, in the presence of those who choose to love without condition. And in that choosing, they became something unshakable. Not because they were unhurt, but because they healed together. Because they forgave the pain of the past without forgetting its lesson. Because they decided that what almost broke them would become the soil from which something even stronger would rise. So when the cub took his first steps further from the den, he didn't look back out of fear. He looked back and saw two steady silhouettes watching over him. And he smiled, not because he needed them right then, but because he knew they were always there. And that knowing would carry him for the rest of his life. It would carry him through storms he had yet to meet, through nights when the forest whispered warnings and he had only memory to guide him. It would be in the way he stood when others fled, in the calm breath he took before acting, in the silent strength he didn't know had been given to him by watching two broken giants refuse to let go of each other. And even as time moved forward and his steps grew wider, that early love, unspoken, unwavering, would remain a compass. Not as a voice in his head, but as an echo in his bones. A knowing that he had been chosen, not because he was easy, not because he was perfect, but because he was theirs, and that was enough. He would grow into his own strength, yes, but it would always be rooted in theirs. He would learn to climb and fall and rise again. And each time he did, he would do it not alone, but with the quiet rhythm of their presence pulsing beneath every choice. Because when you are raised by those who stayed, you don't need to fear the unknown. You meet it with the courage they once lent you, and eventually you call it your own. And the love that held him first, under the trembling leaves of that shadowed den, would still hold him, even when they were gone. Not in the air or the trees, but in how he moved through the world. Gentle, brave, steady, just like them. That's how legacies last, not in names etched in stone, but in the way a life walks through the world with softness born of survival, and fierceness born of being loved enough to stand tall. And when the world asked where that strength came from, he wouldn't need to explain. It was in the way he waited when others rushed, in the patience he showed the ones still learning how to trust, in the way he never walked ahead without looking back, to make sure no one was left behind. That wasn't something he was taught, it was something he absorbed, breath by breath, in a den where love held the line between life and loss. Because what he had witnessed wasn't just survival, it was devotion in its rawest, rarest form. A father who stayed, though he could have left. A mother who gave everything she had, then gave more. And together they chose not just to protect, but to become a shelter in motion, a moving sanctuary stitched together by the promise that no one would ever be left to face the world alone. So even as he grew into independence, even as his stride stretched longer and his gaze wandered wider, he carried that early shelter with him. Not as a crutch, but as a quiet power, the kind that doesn't shout to be seen, the kind that waits and watches and rises when it's needed most. And maybe that's what real love becomes when it endures. Not a chain, but a compass. Not something that binds you, but something that frees you, with direction, with memory, with quiet assurance that you belong to something greater than the moment you're in. And in every path he'd one day choose, in every challenge that would try to shake him, it would live there still, in the center of him. That legacy, that steadiness, that fierce, unshakable love that started the day he opened his eyes to find not one, but two hearts staying close enough to hold him. And years later, when the wind shifted and the trees bent low under the weight of age and time, he returned. Not because he was lost, but because some places don't fade, no matter how far you roam. The den was gone. The earth had swallowed its outline. But he remembered where it once stood. And in that clearing, with the light softer now and the silence fuller, he stood still, not to mourn, to honor, to remember not just who they were, but what they gave and what it made of him. There were no stones to mark the spot, no names carved into bark, but the forest remembered, the ground beneath his feet remembered, and he, who had grown tall on the strength of their staying, carried them forward in every step. Because some stories don't need retelling, they are lived again and again, each time someone chooses to stay. Each time love is offered not as a rescue, but as a promise. And in that quiet place, he stayed a little longer. Not because he had to, but because they once had. If this story moved you, stay kind, stay present, stay close. That's where love begins.